Can I stand over here? Can you hear me if I stand over here?
A little less.
A little less?
Okay, I'll stand over here. All right, so we're starting a little bit late, but that's okay. So thank you all very, very much for coming to the first event for the English Department Reading Series for the spring. And if you look at the calendar for the fall, for the spring, we have a great number of readings coming up. So I'm just going to announce the next two. February 21st at LUCA, so the Louise Hopkins Underwood Center for the Arts, we have 3 writers. We have Aracelis Germain, poet who works across genres. We have Nirmala Paeth Ducharme, did I say that right? And she's a PhD student here, and she's invested in Black spiritual poetics. And then we have Henry Ainsworth, who's a senior psychology major and English philosophy minor. And then on March 7th, here in this room again, we have poet and dancer Nicholas Goodley, and they have published a book with Copper Canyon called Black Swim. So those are 2 exciting events to look forward to for the future. Okay, so let's focus on tonight. So I'm going to introduce Jennifer Tubbs, which is a great honor for me since I've gotten to work with her for the last 2 years since she's been at Tech. And Jennifer has a BA from Georgetown in political science and an MFA from the University of New Mexico. She's done a great deal since she's been here, but prior to coming here, she taught English in India as well as in Santiago, Chile. And in the time that she's been here, she's presented at 3 conferences. One of them in Lisbon at Nova University. She participated in the Comp Lit Symposium last year, and also this fall in the Texas Tech Association of Creative Writing Teachers Conference. She is a yoga teacher as well as a writer, and her interests include magical realism, Irish folklore, Celtic mythology, as well as traditional medicine in Ireland. And she writes fiction, nonfiction, as well as poetry. So it's a great honor to introduce Jennifer.
Just gonna see if I can move the little Zoom.
Yeah, was I in the camera?
Yeah, you were. I think that I just, whoops, wrong way, okay. The Zoom is more difficult to navigate than anticipated. Okay, whoop.
There you go.
Yeah, there we go. Oh, dang it. There we go. Okay. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Jackie. It's an honor to be with you. And I'm going to be reading a piece, a work in progress. So Lucy and friends will see this one later in the semester. But I've sort of dismembered it and stitched it back together, so hopefully it makes sense as is. So, it's called The Soap Factory, tentatively. Alrighty. The summer of Quetzalcoatl was the summer of birds and the beginning of your life studying them. After the saponified one, we started seeing them everywhere. The 3-wattled bellbird perched outside the bodega, the bare-necked umbrella bird lurking near our favorite taco stand, circling for scraps, the lilac-crowned Amazon squawking in the palms that wrestled against the soap factory. Then there was the one, I don't remember what kind, you're the bird expert, not me, and the Eastern tulips by the cathedral we walked past on our way to volunteer. Must have been snakes, you guessed, turning the ransacked nest over in your hands. The egg that fell out onto the grass looked smooth and pastel as a Jordan almond. It's already dead, he said, cracking open the shell and letting the shards fall into my palm. I held their feathered lightness close to me. Can't feel a thing, he reassured me. See? You flicked his head until it hung by a handful of tendons drooping by a half-formed wing. All the same, I made a home for him. Back at the hostel, I worked thick braids of clay into a sort of home, dirt brown and glow brown. I tucked him in as if he had come from my own body as he lay in the hammock nearby watching. The summer we found each other, I thought a lot about death, about why I wanted it the way other girls my age wanted breast implants or one of the Jonas Brothers. I thought about my diligent whittling away at my body, trying to seduce death with a hard knob of patella, a shoulder blade threatening to pierce the skin. You counted my ribs on top of our yellowed mattress, 10, 11, 12, like a xylophone. You yelled so loud I thought the hostel owners might kick us out. Still, I was proud. I puffed my chest out so the clavicle protruded, delicate as a sparrow's wing. We were backpacking through Mexico our senior year, reveling in the novelty of poverty after mere decades inside our middle-class cocoons. Your father was a banker at the local Wells Fargo branch, mine a construction company owner. Your mother was a kindergarten teacher, mine a stay-at-home mom. It was also conformist. We had independently decided, upon reading Che Guevara's motorcycle diaries and smoking inordinate amounts of weed, our family's pitiable adherence to bourgeois values. So maybe it was that, the pot and Che, that prompted you to whisper into my unwashed hair that summer, "You're not like other girls." And maybe it was the sickle and hammer tattoo on your bicep, or your pond brown eyes, I mean that in the most complimentary way possible, or the simple truth of my ignorance that made me smile. I wanted, then, to be different from other women, to separate myself from what I perceived as frivolity and hyperconsumption, to ally myself with asceticism and deprivation. I went running in the mornings with the full force of the sun on my back. We did laps around the Zocalo under the stars. We ate eggs for every meal, pasta if we were feeling fancy. One night, on a pre-dinner mission to buy the cheapest beer we could find, I slipped my pocket knife between my fingers like a talon. When I was a girl, my dad taught me how to gut trout with a penknife, how to defend myself from men who would not be as kind to me as he was. The Michigan sky was gray as fish scales, the air cold and metallic, and we would go into the lake together. He showed me how to tear off the dorsal fin, how to scoop out the intestines to get at the liquid muscle that we'd fry and eat right there, just like the pioneers did, he said, if they made it that far up north. "Why the knife?" you asked, nodding at my fist. "Because you didn't know how to clean a trout, and you had no need for knives at night, so impervious were you in the very places where I was most vulnerable." For this, I loved you, the boy child wandering through Central America with your knapsack full of twice-worn t-shirts and 3-in-1 shower gel. You stuck your fingers directly into a jar of Jif. "Here," I offered you the knife once we were safely inside the bodega. Bananas hung above us, suspended in the air on giant hooks like flailing yellow perch. "Thanks," he said, licking peanut butter off the blade. A little girl dressed in her Sunday best smiled at us from one of the rows of imported Fruit Loops and Lucky Charms. I was thinking about what that said about us as a nation, shipping out processed cereal products with enough sugar in them to trigger a transnational childhood obesity epidemic, when the girl's mother appeared. Her eyes went from her doll-like daughter to your tongue tracing my switchblade and back, then at me as if for confirmation. I thought about the first time a man had looked at me the way the woman imagined you were looking at her daughter. When I was 5, a hand slithered under my skirt during the Sunday sermon at the First United Methodist Church of Grand Rapids. I don't remember his face, but I can still feel his clammy fingers, blue-blooded and serpentine. The store manager kicked us out for loitering before we could get our grimy hands on any Tecate. The cheap metal cans glinted at us from behind a pyramid of nutty avocados, jeered through the glass doors as we sat, dirty and emulating pennilessness as only 2 white college kids could. It was then that I realized I wanted nothing more than to walk through the world as you did, unseen and unseeing. "What should we do now?" you chirped, still clutching the plastic jar. The soap factory was called Quetzalcoatl, after the Aztec serpent bird god, meant to evoke royalty. We had each registered online to volunteer abroad on a site that matched college-age young people in the U.S. with worthy causes in the, quote, global south, unquote, which was the new term for places kids like us went to spend their spring breaks and a portion, though certainly not all, of their summers. You'll remember the name of the NGO better than I can. Something about helping indigenous Yucatecan communities establish a presence in the artisanal body products industry. Volunteering there meant shaving wax off imperfect cubes and cutting ourselves often, our blood mixing with lavender and patchouli into bars that people back in the US would lather onto unsunburnt skin in their walk-in showers in some remote corner of Midwestern suburbia, such as the very ones that had produced us. The temporary physical and psychic distance between them, the soap buyers, and us, the soap makers, wrapped us up in such righteousness each day as we chiseled the wax down to perfection, just as I whittled my bones into nothingness. Come over here, you instructed me, signaling to the bar of soap you were working on. Look, you said, your finger pointing at a dark patch in the center. Do you see it? You asked. There, trapped in the glycerin, was a bird. As if fossilized in amber, the feathers spread like fingers, pushing up against the edge of the bar. Its beak was open, forever hungry. It's a sheartail, you said authoritatively. Its magenta bill glowed through the layers of wax. You can only find them here. They're endangered. Even then, you knew your species. In your palm, the dead bird seemed to sing. At least that's what I heard, shifting myself up onto the wooden table where we coaxed the soap into uniform rectangles. The nub of your thumb worked itself in between my thighs. You're beautiful, you said. I smiled, returning your hand to your side where it stayed. What's the matter? You used your soft voice with me, the one you always use with birds. It's just not a good time for me. What does that mean? When is a good time? I was thinking about what I meant, about when is a good time for anything, really, when a wave of sleepiness alerted us to the factory owner's arrival back from his harvest. Lavender lulled me to an in-between space, dulled my senses until my eyes drooped. The thump of herbs, neat in their tight bundles, hitting the patio flooded them open. ¿A usted le puedo ayudar? You called out in your intermediate 2 Spanish. When no answer came, you walked out into the light, leading me to the cool stillness of the workshop. Alone, I watched you in the window. I saw the night beetles crawl out from their hiding places under the dirt, begin to congregate outside as the afternoon slipped into dusk. Iridescent, their wings shifted, brushed against each other with hot friction. My back found the ropes of a hammock, and I slid into it slowly, savoring the rough anakin against my skin. My fingers, with their chipped pink lady polish, wandered across my rib cage, counting 10, 11, 12, like a xylophone. Fingers spread across the window, plunging the galaxies of soap into night. Something slithered towards me from the dark square of the door, a forked tongue flickering between scaled lips. It wasn't a monster, not exactly, but a kind of creature unlike you or me. I swallowed hard when he pressed himself against my hips, voiceless. A thought snaked its way into my awareness, soft and sweet as rainwater. All language is born from birds. From the bowels of the jungle, a night noise, jaguar, I thought, or some other exotic animal I had only ever seen with my nose pressed against the glass at the zoo. Summer spent feeding minnows to the largest alligator outside of Florida, crickets, Precious, the Komodo dragon, with her thick rope of a tongue draped out of her mouth, as if just for me, as if to say, I could eat you if I wanted. A low hum rose in the room. Constellations of pollen-clogged pistols rained down around me, escaping from the bundles that hung from the rafters like bats. I unraveled at the navel as a shock of energy migrated to my spinal cord. Light years away, I saw you in the small square of light, piling the lavender to neat pyramids outside. The old farmer had disappeared, swallowed up by the dark. Meanwhile, I guided the creature to me with a strong hand in the tufts of his head. I wanted him to feel the beating of a human heart. The ribbon of his tongue unfurled at the nape of my neck, flicked under the hard edge of my sternum. this world, he rasped. Come home with me. But it wasn't the right time for that either. Besides, there was you to think about. You who were walking up the steps, turning the doorknob, your scent of lavender and yerba buena filling the room. So I told him no. And I don't regret that, even after what happened between you and me. When you saw me splayed out in a hammock, a bundle of bones and not much else, my face contorted with either anguish or ecstasy, you were angry. Now's not a good time, huh? You paced the length of the workshop with your hands on your hips. I feel like you don't trust me. It's not that. No, it's not that, I said, and sat up as much as I could. I don't know. I really just don't know. When he turned around, started to heap lavender bundles to the doorframe, I licked my fingers and tasted the sea. We were the kind of happy that only comes from eating, tomato drunk, lying on our backs where the rows of lumpy vegetables tapered off. The neighbors hadn't pilfered the hard-won fruits of our labor, as it turned out. Arthritic as they were, they didn't venture outside. And, like the selfish gods of our new domain, we didn't offer them any. That summer in our cramped apartment on Broadmoor, we ate fat heirloom tomatoes right off the vine, not wasting time to finagle them into crazy salads. We gnawed on rolling pin-sized cucumbers that tasted like bugs, ripped the little green hats off strawberries and swallowed them whole without even rinsing them first. Red juice burst all over our faces as we reveled in what we had grown. How long till they start sprouting, does the packet say? You had asked from your station at the hose after we had strewn the seeds in the ground. 4 to 5 days, I called out as I peeled off my muddy gloves. The two of us marveled at how little time it takes for life to begin. I want to be buried in this garden, I announced to you, the empty beer bottles and the stars. Don't talk like that, you said, wiping your mouth on your sleeve. What? I shrugged. We all have to go sometime. Not you. You're invincible, you said, and you gave me a light slug on the shoulder to prove it. I didn't believe you then, but I know now I'm invincible, for better or worse, the same way a garden is. We pluck a tomato or cucumber, a squash or a persimmon, eat it, and still it sprouts each April after the first rain. The soil holds onto its DNA, spits it right back up again. Life is always right under our feet. So there we were that night, a bed of wet leaves and spring worms underneath us, talking about death and not wanting to die, and maybe, just a little bit, loving each other, the way we always needed but could never ask for. Your hand pushed itself into my jeans, tentacling its way inside, prying the meat of me open with callous fingers. On top of me, you pulsed like a swarm of jellyfish, each sting an epiphany. I needed to feel you inside me, cold and hard like a harpoon. Let's build an altar, I said. To who? Quetzalcoatl. That's how we met, after all, at the soap factory. What, goes into an altar? Whatever we want. We piled rocks that we liked for no particular reason, my mother's tarnished wedding band, a picture of the Aztec god that we printed off Wikipedia. You sanded down a piece of plywood to put everything on, and we propped it up against a wrist-thick okra vine and hollowed out squash carcass. Finally, you christened our shrine with the radius of a crow that we had found by the pond a few days prior. It should be an altar to something else. Joy, love, peace, anything, since we never figured out who Quetzalcoatl was, you declared, lighting a joint. Okay, I said, thinking about the soap factory owner and how he didn't believe in anything. I wanted to believe in something, so I held my hope in secret. And when we lay down in the dirt and grass and rolled around like kids, when we stopped, my elbow had crushed a swath of cilantro and your calf had landed on the basil. I love you, I said, and I meant it. What is love, though, really? You asked, philosophical after a few tokes. I thought about my dad teaching me how to clean a fish, about the way his knife slid in between the pink flesh so smoothly. If I had thought you would have understood, I would have told you. Start with the scales, rip out the dorsal fin at the base of my head, scoop out the gray intestines, slick ropes filled with bits of bottom beaters. Here's the thick fish slime of me, ready for your teeth. But you wouldn't have, so I settled for, think love is a kind of death. And you nodded like I had said something profound. It was my idea, of course. Everything was always my idea. Something I had read in Cosmo or Teen Vogue, although I was well into my 20s by then. The judge would say I asked for it, would say this is what I had wanted. And he would be right in a way. Are you sure you want this? You asked, fingers wrapped around my throat, heart lined to trachea. I had worked on making my voice small, so small it could slip through the topsoil and start to spiral down, 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 to the place where all language is swallowed up. So I nodded instead. And that's when I heard it, the humming that had buzzed around me ever since the summer of Quetzalcoatl, since before I was born maybe. It sounded like a mother's lullaby, cicadas every 17 years, the crunch of tectonic plates as they slowly drift away from each other over millennia, the hot pain of creation. Quetzalcoatl demands a sacrifice, you panted into my ear, deviating from the script we had agreed upon. The humming grew louder and louder, 1,000 bees swarming, millions of beetles rubbing their opalescent wings together. I motioned to the bear carving I always carried, tucked into my bra. You tugged it loose and aimed for the altar, slinging it at the tomato plants that had become infested by aphids by then, a final offering. You pressed down on my windpipe, and I saw my face turn red, then blue, and then purple from above. My mouth tried to form the safe word we had agreed on, red, red like the tomatoes we had gorged ourselves on that summer night. But only air escaped. I knew then that you were wrong. That what you had whispered into my dirty hair all those years ago was a lie. I have always been, exactly like all the other girls. There is no hierarchy in the bones beneath your feet. Somewhere far below my suddenly high vantage point, you called out a name that no longer belonged to me. The little pastel egg we found on our walk to the soap factory is still interred behind the hostel where I left it. I remember the hard clay flaking off my rusty shovel the day I buried him. You were trying to read a Mexican newspaper from the hammock, laughing, not knowing you would do the same for me a few years later. You looked up when I threw a clump of soil your way, and we were happy together for a moment, sweat soaking through our shirts under the sun. I can still feel the amniotic slick feathers in my palm as I push the unborn bird into the dirt. That's it. Thank you. So now I have the pleasure of introducing Jackie, and she said she was embarrassed by compliments, so I will keep the intro short. But Jackie, as we all know, is a fantastic member of the creative writing faculty here at Texas Tech, and she taught the poetry workshop that basically introduced me to poetry. And I still don't think I'm a writer of poetry, but anything I know is thanks to her. So she has published 4 YA crossover novels, nonfiction, hybrid work, and craft essays. She's also co-edited 3 anthologies of contemporary writing, most recently Family Resemblance, an anthology and exploration of 8 hybrid literary genres. She's won many, many awards, so I'm just going to give a sampling right now. An NEA Fellowship in Prose, a Residency at the Banff Center, and the Mary Roberts Reinhardt Award for Nonfiction. She also has a lovely, sweet dog named Archie, and she's an incredibly talented horsewoman. And in the interest of keeping this short, I will just say a few words on her most recent book, Exit, Pursued by a Bear, which won the prize Americana. And it's a fantastic collection that, in my view, sort of balances tenderness with the often cruel realities of life, but that's a balance that is masterfully struck. And I think that it's a testament to the healing power of art. So I will give the floor to Jackie.
Oh, thank you. So am I on the screen? Yeah. Okay. All right, thank you very much. That was a very generous introduction. But I think that idea of healing is perhaps a way of introducing the collection. So I don't know if any of you know where the title "Exit Pursued by a Bear" comes from. It's from Shakespeare. Does anyone recall? It's from one of the romances. Yes, Kevin?
A Winter's Tale.
Exactly, A Winter's Tale. Very good. My God, I love it. Yeah, so it's my favorite stage direction in any play, and just in general in theater. And one thing about the romances is that they came after the tragedies for Shakespeare, and I always found that really compelling, that he didn't end with tragedy, but instead he ended with romance. And the epigraph, one of the epigraphs to this book, is there is an art that doth mend nature, change it rather, yet the art itself is nature. And I've always found that deeply inspiring since I read A Winter's Tale, which was, oh goodness gracious, 30 years ago, probably. All right, so I'm going to read the first story in the collection, and I'm going to abridge it somewhat. So one of the things I should probably say in terms of abridging is that it's very much about a father, George, and his adult daughter, Maggie, and a special creature named Hugo, who you'll meet. But Maggie has had a long-term relationship with a very charismatic but dangerous individual named Jacob. So some of the information or parts of the narrative dealing with Jacob I'm just going to cut out for the sake of time. All right. The raven and the epigraph. The capacity of an animal to cause damage is proportional to its intelligence. When George Kokoschka first moved to the Southwest nearly 25 years ago, he relished visiting Santa Fe, its restaurants, its atmosphere, its art. These days, the Wyeth herd is still worthwhile, and there's the Pushkin, which showcases modern and contemporary Russian art, birch trees in winter, and the like. But for the most part, Santa Fe's galleries have gone downhill, catering to a moneyed, sunburned Americans who parade up and down Canyon Road in expensive white sneakers or those hideous mountaineering sandals that ruin even the most beautiful woman's legs. George is thinking precisely this as he stands before a gallery called Echo Cool, an establishment that was definitely not here the last time he came to visit his daughter. The gallery seems to be exclusively devoted to brightly painted wooden chickens wearing cowboy boots and its turquoise-bordered windows. Hundreds of them. Blonde chickens, Japanese chickens, chickens with afros, chickens in uniforms, even a chicken done up to resemble Betty Boop in Western gear. Do you see something you like? A female voice asks. George looks at the woman in purple velveteen pants and what looks like cross-training shoes. No, he says, nothing at all. And then meeting her gaze, he nods and adds, but thank you. Although he hasn't seen Maggie in nearly 4 months, George takes his time as he makes his way down Canyon Road. He and his ex-wife, Alex, may have fought over their only daughter during the long years of their embattled marriage. But these days, their mutual concern for Maggie is a point of connection, perhaps the only remaining one. When George telephoned Alex to say that he was driving up to see her, she encouraged him to try to convince Maggie to take the assistant's job at her Israeli friend Yossi's gallery in Chicago. $50,000 a year, George said, and Maggie could rent a refurbished studio just down the street. It would be a chance to start over, and we both know she would benefit. Alex's words brought back Maggie's last breakdown some 14 months ago. 2 weeks in the psych ward, twice daily pharmaceutical cocktails. I'll see what I can do, he said. Maggie is already waiting for George at El Farol when he arrives. He'd hoped that tonight, their first meal together, Maggie would have left Hugo at home. Instead, when he catches sight of Maggie, her long hair twined into a messy bun now streaked with the first hints of gray, a heavy necklace of turquoise beads making her long neck look even longer. Hugo is perched on her shoulder, his black feathers as sleek and well-kept as always. Daddy! He strides towards her, and several of the diners' heads turn in their direction. Despite her ill-fitting peasant wear, Maggie is a beautiful woman, as her mother was and is even now that she has come into her late 60s. His ex-wife's beauty had always been his undoing, the reason he put up with her demands and her criticisms for too many years, even going into too much debt on that house with the garden that they sold for a loss after the divorce, a circumstance that still eats at George more than 15 years later. Maggie has none of her mother's will, and sometimes George believes a little bit of Alex, just a sprinkling, the way a dash of cloves or cinnamon in Lyman's bread recipe or a stew would have done Maggie a world of good. At the very least, it would have made her tougher, gelled that self-preservation instinct he fears she lacks. "Hello, Magpie," George says, all too aware of the dramatic irony of the nickname, inherited on a very early trip to New Mexico when she was a child. He leans forward to kiss her, only to have his efforts thwarted by Hugo, who greets him with harsh quirks and flaps his wings violently, all the while retaining his tight perch on Maggie's shoulder. "I'm amazed you can bring him to a restaurant," George says. "We're sitting outside. You're allowed to bring animals if you sit outside." "Ah," George says, noticing a drowsy dachshund sprawled beneath the nearby table. "Besides," Maggie adds, "they know Hugo here. He's a bit of a celebrity." "I can only imagine," George says, relieved that he is not usually here to witness his daughter's jaunts around town with the raven. Would she become a bird lady in old age? Was she a bird lady already? How long did ravens live? Hugo has already been around for a dozen years, and from the glossy looks of his wings and his sharp black eye, it seems as if he has at least as many years ahead. They look over the menu, and Hugo, still glued to Maggie's shoulder, tugs at her loose strands of hair, almost as a lover would, reminding George what he knows about ravens. Creatures of fidelity, they bond for life. As far as George can tell, Hugo views Maggie as his mate. And Maggie? George wonders, for the bird is far more than a pet, unless a child and a companion. A server passes with a platter of something smoky and red, and George is disturbingly reminded of those early days with Hugo, when Maggie was still living at home. On the chance that she would return him to the wild, Maggie brought home roadkill and chopped it up with a special knife and cutting board. George forbade using their own tools. It was a neighbor who spotted Maggie scouring the highway at dusk and said something to George, who had no idea how to begin to explain. Thankfully, Maggie now feeds him canned dog food, chicken, and fish. It's almost as if Hugo understands that George is thinking about him, for he hops down from Maggie's shoulder and approaches, stopping to cock his head and look at him in the eye. "Do you think he wants to be friends after all these years?" George asks suspiciously. "Maybe," Maggie says, then chortles to Hugo. When George laughs, his guard momentarily down, Hugo draws back his beak, a sign of attack, and George swats at him with the menu. "Daddy!" Instantly, Hugo protests violently, his squawks turning loud and plaintive, as if George were the attacker. A few of the other diners turn to stare, and more than a few glare at George. "That bird of yours is going to bite me before the meal is through," George says. "Don't be ridiculous. He just has to get used to you again. He's very protective of me. You should be glad. He's as good, better than any guard dog, and smarter too." No one would disbelieve that Hugo, who has learned to open cabinets and doors, and even sticky gates with his nearly 3-inch beak, is not intelligent. Yet how good is a bird who buries bacon in a neighbor's yard, only to return later to recover it? A bird who steals shiny objects, buttons, coins, even a turquoise ring, hoarding them in his cage. More precisely, how much protection can such a creature offer against an intruder who could climb through one of Maggie's shakily latched windows, or Ginny the equally flimsy lock on her front door? Hugo begins ripping off a chunk of bread, and it takes everything in George's power to hold his peace. "Miss," he says to the server, could I have a separate basket of bread?" "Of course," she says, with a smile. When Maggie first brought the injured fledgling home to San Antonio, she had just broken up with Jacob for the first time. The day before Maggie returned from working at a camp for underprivileged teens, Jacob actually drove across town and deposited the things in sloppily packed boxes on George's front porch. It was during the workday when George was at school. Alex, who had abandoned Texas and their marriage for her native Chicago 3 years before Jacob came onto the scene, just said, "Poor Mags. Well, it's good riddance to bad rubbish, and for a while it's going to be rough. Are you sure you're going to be able to handle it?" As it turned out, George didn't have to, not this first time. When George fetched Maggie from the airport, she held Hugo in her arms. The bird still had his pin feathers then, and resembled a bizarre miniature gargoyle, with his hideous gray-black head and that large beak that somehow reminded George of a smiling elephant tusk. What is this?" George asked as she tucked the bird into a little box on her lap. "This is Hugo," she said. "A crow?" Hugo is a raven, Daddy. They're the largest member of the Corbin family. As if confirming his future alpha status in Maggie's life, little Hugo squawked in agreement, nearly causing George to rear-end a Mercedes on the way out of the airport. But in the bird's defense, when Maggie got home and saw her sweaters and books and shoes and the bits and pieces that Jacob had thrown together, she didn't cry. No, the fledgling gargoyle's needs, his bi-hourly feedings, his daily and most rambunctious bath, pulled Maggie through, a point that was difficult for George to communicate to Alex when she telephoned. "What looks good?" Maggie asked, slicing up the sardine for Hugo. "The potato saffron soup, I think, and the octopus. But no," he says, "the oysters. They're not from the Gulf, are they?" he asks the server who appears at their side. "Canada," she says. "Ah, good." "I'll have the same thing," Maggie says. The server's name is Giselle, and it turns out she's a massage therapist at the same studio where Maggie teaches yoga. And a side dish of stuffed olives for Hugo. George holds his tongue. The olives are $12 a plate. "Of course," Giselle said, stroking the bird's head. "He tolerates you," George says. "The little fellow's a ladies' man," Giselle replies. "We come here often, Daddy," Maggie says, winking at Giselle. "I told you." A sudden breeze sends a napkin to the floor, and George twists around and down to snag it. "You're really fit," Giselle tells George. "Do you practice yoga too?" Maggie splutters with laughter. "You couldn't get my dad to practice yoga if you paid him." "No?" Giselle, George thinks, is looking at me almost flirtatiously. "My father plays tennis, at least he used to. He literally studied the techniques of John McEnroe." "McEnroe?" Giselle asks. "I never studied McEnroe," George says. "Arthur Ashe, Bjorn Borg, they were my teachers. I'm self-taught, you see. And for your information, I still play tennis every Saturday with Edgar, his best friend," Maggie tells Giselle, a history professor. "Ah," Giselle says, winking as she turns away. Her ass, George realizes, is shapely and full, not a skinny woman's ass. He looks away, meeting Hugo's beady gaze. "Watch out for her," Maggie says. "What do you mean?" "She's checking you out. She's a man-eater, Daddy, and a very expensive one." "Magpie, I have no intention of getting involved with a woman your age." "She's 5 years older than me," Maggie grins. Nevertheless, after dinner, George leaves Giselle an ample tip. "Come back for lunch one day this week," she says as they're leaving. "My treat." "Man-eater, Daddy," Maggie whispers, all the while smiling at Giselle and waving goodbye. Maggie takes George's hand and they make their way down Canyon Road. She's already offered twice to let him sleep on her pull-out sofa, but they both know that would never work. By the time George was 40, he'd reached a point in his life where a good queen bed with a firm mattress and linens in a clean, tastefully furnished room mattered as much to him as sex. It's been nearly a decade since he's had sex, much to his dismay, but he always sleeps in good hotels. And then there's the fact of his insomnia, which always worsens when he comes to this high-altitude town. Just in terms of time. Okay. Let's see. They near Garcia Street and pause before the Selby Fleetwood Gallery. "I thought of modeling for one of the artists they represent," Maggie says. "Model? And will you?" "Maybe. He's working on a series of reclining nudes." "Heaven help us," George says, thinking of Modigliani and not Titian. "How do you know this artist?" "He takes my vinyasa class." George trembles, fearing that his daughter for whom he once cherished such high hopes, will add nude modeling to her resume. But before he can pursue this train of thought, Hugo, perched on Maggie's shoulder, lifts into flight. Within seconds, Hugo is high, high above their heads, a Japanese ink drawing of a bird against a palette of purple rose sky. Aren't you concerned, George says, looking up at the brilliant creature. No, Maggie says. If we were in the mountains, I'd be worried about eagles or owls, but he's safe here. Don't tell me you're worried about him. No, George says. How could I worry about a bird that's always ready to stab me? Still watching Hugo's sky dance as he spirals up and barrels down, George understands, or believes he understands, for the space of those elastic moments, a space not unlike the distance between the planes of color in one of Rothko's canvases, part of the raven's allure. Who would not want to fly like that? So George asks as they stand there together, both of their eyes fixed on Hugo, who is flying overhead, a circus performer, a daredevil tuned into their attention. Have you given any thought to what your mother said? About what? Chicago, George says, the position of the gallery. The salary, the opportunity would be excellent. Yes, he's an Israeli, Maggie says, and he's been divorced 3 times. So he's going to talk my ear off about politics, and he has a history of bad love affairs. Your mother would never recommend a bad situation, George says, though he himself isn't wild about the gregarious, chain-smoking Yossi, who tried to get him to buy a drawing of owls by some contemporary artist for an exorbitant price. How does she know what's good and bad for me, Maggie asks. George doesn't answer. After all, Alex did leave them when Maggie was in her second year of college. You would at last be able to do something with your degree, he says. Oh, Daddy, I am using my degree, just not in the conventional way. George groans. How can he possibly buy this when he knows how she lives, has seen what she wears, and that ridiculous demanding bird? She should have released the raven into the wild years ago. Instead, she spent months getting a permit. Of course, were he to bring up Hugo now, she would remind George of that pastel by Picasso, the one of the Paris barmaid and her pet raven that hangs in the MoMA. The pastel had been of one of George's favorite works by Picasso, whose semi-abstractions he'd found overrated, until Hugo came into their lives. Besides, Maggie says now, I thought you understood how much I love it here, how hard it would be to leave. But you don't even have health insurance, George feels like telling her, or a lease on a decent apartment, much less a house. In 6 years, you'll be 40, and I'll be 74. The men in my family are lucky to live past 70. Who's going to look after you then? Just then, Hugo comes whooshing down from the sky and alights on Maggie's shoulder. Hi, 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 he says. Pretty bird, pretty Hugo. Both George and Maggie laugh, and George knows they will not speak of Maggie's future again tonight. No, they will walk on together in semi-silence until they reach the St. Francis Hotel, where he will kiss her goodnight, then sit down in the big mauve reading chair beside the window and read the latest biography of Kandinsky. He will read deep into the night and drink a glass of Hennessy he bought at the liquor store 2 blocks from the gallery with the wooden chickens. Okay, I'm going to skip quite a bit ahead. All right, so I'm just going to go to the following afternoon for the sake of time, where he goes to meet Maggie, who is a nanny. So he's had some other adventures in the meantime, but it's almost 1:45 p.m. by the time George arrives in the park. He's afraid that Maggie may have left, but no, she is there, sitting on a bench and knitting something that looks like a shawl. A shawl as her charges. He sees them over by the fountain and rush the pigeons. Standing there, George feels as if his daughter is missing something. I'll be goddamned if I miss that crazy bird, he thinks. Daddy, Maggie says as he approaches, I almost gave up on you. I'm sorry, he says, something came up. Something was Giselle. She nods, tucks the knitting into her bag, and calls to the children. They've grown, George says, as the twins amble over. They are dressed in overalls today, green for Clara and a blue stripe for Ben. On their feet, they sport the same hideous mountaineering sandals that so many people wear now. All George can think is how expensive those sandals must be and how lovely Maggie used to look in her patent leather Mary Janes. "Where's Hugo?" Clara asks. "What?" George looks from the child to his daughter. "I thought you'd be bringing him." "Clara adores Hugo," Maggie says. "I suppose she got it into her head that you'd be looking after him today." "Heaven help me," George says. "Heaven?" Clara asks. George shakes his head. He's forgotten how liberal-minded children can be. The children climb into the stroller and Maggie buckles them in, gentle with them at ease. She brushes the hair from Ben's eyes, touches Clara's cheek with her forefinger, and George feels a stab of longing and loss. Perhaps a minute later, they make their way down the street to the ice cream parlor, where, Maggie tells him, the twins have vanilla, or crazy colors, and she always orders a double scoop of hazelnut and honey cream. Later that evening, back at Maggie's casita, which George would rather not visit again, for in the dwindling light, he sees her next-door neighbor's collection of junked cars, crumbling furniture, and recycling. He witnesses his daughter's greeting ritual with Hugo. When she performs, he knows at each and every reunion, no matter how little time has passed since she and the raven have been apart. The ritual amounts to this. As soon as they step inside, Hugo hops out of his 4x4-foot cage that dominates the living area and onto a perch nearby. He makes a chortling noise and bows his head sideways and fluffs out his feathers, and Maggie steps forward to stroke his fuzzy head. Watching, George must admit there is something touching in this greeting, which is far more affectionate than any of his reunions with Alex ever were, even during the happiest of times. "Hi, hi," Hugo says. "Happy Hugo, pretty bird." "Does he understand what he's saying?" George asks. "I don't know for sure," Maggie says, bowing to touch foreheads with Hugo, who chortles and gurgles, but I'd say he does. The greeting ceremony, for it is that, George realizes, with a formality and an order that is both scripted and oddly beautiful in the way of some choreographed yet spontaneous dance, goes on for a few more minutes. Perhaps it is the turning of Hugo's head towards Maggie's face that is the trigger, or his daughter's caressing tone, or the way she stretches out her hand to let Hugo rope walk up her arm. Whatever it is, it jars something loose in George's memory. The night he and Maggie met Jacob at El Farol, and though he has forgotten it until now, it was Jacob who first introduced him to the restaurant and to the saffron and potato soup specialty that he has eaten on every visit since. That night, Maggie wore an uncharacteristically beautiful dress, a flaring sweep of crinkly red silk that brought to mind Spanish dances and heat. The dress was red, but when she moved, when the skirt billowed around her, George couldn't help but think of Hugo's wings outstretched in flight. So perhaps it was the gracefulness of her that night, the Isadora Duncan meets Pavlova allure that brings the moment back. She wore her hair swept up in a high ponytail that swung behind her as she walked, and there was a little golden bracelet of charms on one of her ankles, her left one, George remembers now. Jacob had brought the golden bracelet back from India, for he regularly visited an ashram there, where he had a guru of his own. The golden bracelet quickly became one of Hugo's favorite playthings, and he singled it out from the other bangles and earrings and shiny things in Maggie's jewelry drawer. When was it that George last saw her wearing the bracelet? It may be that the last time was that night she wore the glowing red dress. It may have been later. The bracelet itself is not what matters. What matters? Maggie telling him that Hugo had carried it up into the sky one afternoon, not so long after Jacob left Santa Fe. After an overnight trip, she said. He refused to hop onto my shoulder, angry, I assumed, because I'd left him behind. She'd left the window open, and soon the bracelet was in Hugo's beak, and his blue-black form had vanished into sky. When Hugo came back from an elaborate flight display that was meant to dazzle Maggie, or so she believed, a display meant to prove his worthiness, to reestablish his place in my heart, the gold bracelet of charms was not with him. How beautiful Maggie looked in that twirling whirl of red on that night at El Farol. How happy she'd been, how buoyant, as she and George walked to the restaurant, talking, laughing. That buoyancy, which was Maggie's gift, her charm, lasted after they arrived at El Farol and waned only when 7 became 7:30 and then 8, and still Jacob did not come. "You're late," Maggie said when he finally showed up at 8:30. She slurred her words a little by then, dizzy from the second glass of wine she drank while waiting. Despite George's insistence, she wanted to wait for Jacob before she ordered food. Jacob apologized, bending down to kiss her cheek, his red hair encircling Maggie's face, the ropey muscles in his arms like the ropes in his hair. "What kept you?" George asked, realizing he'd been gripping the plastic-covered menu with both hands for God knows how long. "Cynthia Reynolds," he said. She threw up her back out riding. "Again," Maggie said, the hiss of the first syllable, all George needed to know. George relives all this as Maggie stands in the tiny kitchen with Hugo chattering on her shoulder. Occasionally, the raven bursts into some unharmonic song in which George recognizes bits of Somewhere Over the Rainbow and Wild Thing, and Maggie joins in. If the bird had ferried anything away into the purple-black mountains, George tells himself now, why could it not have been the memory of Jacob Benedetti that he carried? If there were any justice in this universe, Hugo would have ferried the fierce intelligence and the coiled energy that had been his daughter's lover far, far into those sacred mountains. Yes, Maggie would have been out of her mind with worry while the raven was gone. She might even have torn at her hair like the heroine of some Greek tragedy. But what relief, what unsurpassed joy would she have felt upon the raven's return? George closes his eyes, trying to picture it now. The brilliant blue-black bird riding an updraft across the mountains, the bracelet falling through the turquoise sky, lit by the annihilating sun. Thank you. Yes, okay, so Jennifer and I are happy to take any questions if you have any questions, and there are also some books for sale. Don't feel obligated about that, but I did make brownies and there's chocolates for Valentine's Day, which is tomorrow. So, but we're happy to answer any questions or take any comments if you have them. You know, the stories are actually all more than 10 years old. And so it's very interesting when my friend, I invited her to come, she couldn't come, she read the collection. She said, yeah, these stories really remind me of middle age, grief, loss, but there's also hope. And I was like, God, that was a long time ago I wrote these stories. Yes, Cindy.
Is that wooden chicken shop entirely fictional, or is it basically?
Oh, it is actually true, but I have not been to Santa Fe since 2017. So, but yeah, it actually is a true place. But, you know, I met George, so, but George is a little bit like someone I know, so.
Jackie,
Oh yeah, it's Nathan.
your prose is so lyrical. I was really struck by the scene where the narrator is contemplating Hugo and what it means when they speak. And that scene really, for me, stood up like almost like a poem. And I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about your practice as a poet and how that informs your prose.
Oh, that's a wonderful and very generous question. Yeah. I do think that poetry is an amazing teacher in terms of prose, and I do love lyricism, and I love to read out loud. And I think that in relation, in particular with this story, The Raven, it actually came about because I saw a man actually walking in Santa Fe with a raven. And I was really compelled by this. And I don't know that I wrote a poem, although I've written many poems. I wrote a lot of poems about animals. But I think that image and the energy of the raven and the hope of the raven is, kind of like it's metaphor, really. So, and I love honing in on particular moments and particular images, and I think that in that respect, poetry has taught me so much. So, and I think the other thing is that I absolutely love Virginia Woolf, and so she's such a lyrical writer, and I love the way she's able to move from one consciousness to another, and I find a lot of her writing just immensely, poetic. Henry.
This is for Jennifer. You said you had taken the story you read kind of apart and put it back together. What did you do and why, and are you liking it more now?
Oh, that's so kind of you, Henry. Well, yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I just I took it apart and put it back together for the purpose of time in this moment. But I do think, revision is so powerful. So as I did that, it was sort of instructive because now I've realized that maybe it doesn't need what it had before. So I think that I will probably make some cuts. But what I had before was sort of this, the journey of beginning the garden, and more of the couple's life in Ohio together. But yeah, I kind of like the condensed version. It's like, let's keep it clean, keep it precise. So
It's really tight.
thank you. Yeah, maybe I'll keep it this way. Who knows? Yeah, but I cut like half of it. It was 20 pages. This was 10. So yeah, kill your darlings. I guess that's the moral of the story.
Well, we're gonna let you go unless there are any other questions.
Thank you, Zoom people.
Yes, thank you for coming. Good to see you, or to see your names, and to see Amir's face. To see Hayden's robots. Okay, great, thank you. Okay.